I think he's done.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, everyone who's joined us on Facebook. We're just waiting for Harsh, and we'll begin in the next 30 seconds as he joins again. Thank you for your patience. He's having some trouble, so he will be back in 2 minutes. In the meanwhile, what I'll do is I'll share with our audience a little bit about Indian School of Democracy. And hopefully by then, Harsh will be able to fix the technical error. So those of you who've been joining us for Democracy Samvads or who've been part of different programs, Indian School of Democracy has a mission to nurture principal leaders for Indian politics. And we specifically focus on grassroots politics. We've conducted 2 programs. One was Democracy Express, which is a yatra across 4 states of the country to talk about, to get to know politicians actually. And that's why we are very excited about today's session. So we met almost 20 politicians in that yatra from across different levels to get to know their lives and who's the person, as Harsh says, who's the person behind the persona. So we did that during Democracy Express. And then we conducted a special program called She Represents, for women in politics. And on 26th November, which is Constitution Day, we are going to launch our flagship year-long program. So that's Indian School of Democracy. Harsh, welcome. I was just sharing with our audience what Indian School of Democracy is as we waited for you.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
That's okay. We are very, very excited to host both of you in this Democracy Samvad. In the past Democracy Samvads, we've had politicians and they've shared their journeys. And today will be especially interesting because we'll be hearing from you about the 20 politicians and much more, I think, because both of you have been working and studying politics for a while. So I think I'll just introduce both of you to our audience briefly, and then some of my opening thoughts about the book. So Pradeep Chhibber sir actually is a professor of political science at University of California, Berkeley. He's authored multiple books about Indian politics. So this was about case studies and deep interviews, but he's written about the changing party systems, the religious practices, identity in Indian politics, and so on and so forth. And he also holds the Indo-American Community Chair in India Studies at Berkeley. So thank you for being here, Pradeep.
Thank you, my pleasure, Emake, and congratulations to you for starting this great program.
Thank you. Harsh is currently an MBA candidate at Harvard Business School, so we can see Boston in his background, and hopefully Charles at some point then. He's worked in private equity, he's worked with McKinsey for a little bit, tried finance, but also public policy, where he studied. He was at Berkeley as well, studying both economics and public policy. And he writes very regularly in the print, Hindu, Hindustan Times, and India Today, among many others. So welcome, Harsh, for being here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
For the audience, I think the book we're discussing is India Tomorrow, as all of you would have probably read during the intro and the posters that you read. It's a very, very exciting book because it's actually just interviews with politicians who are young. And the cutoff, I think, if I'm right, and if I remember correctly, is 50 years old, which is pretty young in Indian politics. And these are deep conversations with 20 political leaders about what drives them, what are the challenges. And I think in one of the descriptions, and I love it, and I'm going to repeat it, is that the book is an attempt to know the person behind the persona, because we see and hear so much about these politicians all the time on TV, but it's a genuine attempt to understand who are these people. And that very well aligns with what the work we do at Indian School of Democracy, because we want more and more young people to get into politics. And that's not going to happen by just seeing the glamour or the shosha. It really is going to take a deeper understanding. And that's why this is extremely exciting for us to explore and learn your insights about how were these two conversations? How are these 20 conversations actually? So I would love to start with the question about what surprised you. And I know that may not be the first expected question that you had, but all of us have some or the other image or adjectives associated with politics and hence politicians. So as you really went through this study, which was much more personal as opposed to studying it from a macro lens of trends and patterns, I would love to know, as you were speaking to these people, what really surprised you about politics as a whole? Would love to hear both your thoughts. So anyone can start.
Harsh, why don't you go as always? And I just want to say that Harsh and I may have different takes on this, but that's democratic, I presume. So Harsh.
That's the beauty of it. So Himakshi, I think there are quite a few things that surprised us, which is why I think looking back, we find this journey very fulfilling. I think in many ways, we found that it challenged a lot of our own lazy perceptions of these individuals, the political system, their lives, their ideologies. And I'm sure that a lot of people who read the book feel the same way. That's the feedback we've gotten already. Just to give you a few examples, the first thing that surprised us a lot was that these individuals are far more, hardworking. They've gone through a lot of personal sacrifice. 6 of the 20 politicians that we interviewed lost their fathers at a very young age, and many of them in violent forms. And they've talked about coping with that loss, coping with those struggles, and just the daily sacrifice that they didn't just tell us, but we were witness to. We went, for instance, to Jaipur to meet Sachin Pilot, and we had some anxiety just looking at the hordes of people outside waiting to meet him. And so we tracked him for his experience for that entire day, and we did that for many other politicians. And we saw that it's very difficult for them. All of them complained about being able to find the right balance between personal time and political time. So that would be one big one. I was personally surprised by the extent to which on social and economic outlook and ideology, the extent to which people from all these different parties are very, very aligned. If you told me before writing this book that Varun Gandhi, Rahul Gandhi, and Aditya Thakeray have such similar ideologies and such similar outlooks on certain economic and social issues, I would be shocked. So that's one. Another big way in which I was personally surprised. I'll let Professor Chhibber give his view.
Thanks.
So, since this is the Indian School of Democracy, Harsh and I actually disagree on the last point, which is that there's similarity. I think there's similarity on economics for a very good reason. And the similarity on economics exists because in a country whose economic structure is like India's, which is so, still, largely poor, not well-to-do, you cannot disagree on very fundamental, such as the role of the state in providing for the poor, etc. So I don't think, it would be political suicide to say, I represent the party of the rich, or I represent the party of the well-to-do. So I think on that ground, they are indeed similar, but to me, that is not a surprise. And the fact that there are ideological differences among them on social issues, and which I think are clear as to what they think are important concerns, and those fall along pretty predictable lines. So I think there is, in my view, an ideological difference. There are clear ideological differences among them, but more on the social side rather than on the economic side. And there are good reasons for that. And we all understand those reasons. I think to me, what was surprising was, and I will be candid with your listeners and you as well, is that first, they're remarkably thoughtful people. It's not, and they have people skills. So, and I'm going to, say something unfortunate, that if you think of a similar conversation with the bureaucrat, it would, I think, in my view, go very, very differently. Because to be a politician, you have to have excellent people skills. To be a politician at such a high level, your people skills have to be utterly fantastic. And I think all of them have very good people skills. They knew they could figure out pretty quickly what we were about, what we were trying to do, and they were able to respond to us in a way which I thought was surprising. They were very open, but I think that's because they have great people skills. And I think that's the other thing that's important. The third thing, which, we all know this, and this is something we should think about perhaps, because if you're training people for a school of democracy, is that to get to the top, because all these leaders they're significant national leaders, you need to have a certain command of the English language. You need to have a certain command of being able to deal with media, and you need to have a certain command of being able to deal with a really messy, disorganized schedule, which is, because if you were to follow what Harsh was suggesting, you would have to do, seeing all these throngs of people outside you, your life would be a giant mess. So you need to be able to organize that really well. So I think that's what surprised us. Their openness, their people skills, the fact that they needed a certain felicity with language, and also finally, and I think even more importantly, the need to be really organized. We don't see it, but there is a level of organization that you need to survive in politics at that level.
That is so true. And actually, both of you in some ways answered my second question, which was going to be, because we are in a place where we want to nurture future political leaders, I was going to ask you the question about what are some of the important skills and traits, not just skills, because it's so much about what we call as soft skills. So what are some of those competency, character traits and skills? And I would think that both of you responded to it in some ways, whether it's time management, people skills, organizing, being able to read people, manage media. These are the ones that I picked up. Hardworking, I think, like Harsh was saying, some of the people I've met are the most hardworking politicians ever, and we don't see it. They start their days at 6 a.m. and end at 2 a.m. if at all. So anything that you would want to add from a skills perspective, otherwise I can move to the next part, because this is an important question, I think, for all potential politicians to understand what is it that they should hone in on.
Harsh, as always, you go first.
So I think, Himakshi, one thing that Professor Chhibber and I, discovered going through this exercise, and something we've tried to allude to in our introduction as well, is that we see for all these characteristics that we've spoken about, which are extremely great, most of this generation of politicians are dynasts, and so second generation, sometimes third or fourth, of course, in the case of the Gandhis and a few others, they have not come through the street movements and street protests like the generation before them often have. So the ones who came through emergency, who were jailed during that time, who have been part of so many of those street movements, that generation I felt had a stronger command over their constituencies, over those on the street, are able to really command and drive movements on the street. And that's obviously always a very powerful thing to have in politics, because it almost makes you indispensable. What we found with this generation, many of them sometimes may lack that. And I think that's a very important characteristic. They compensate for that in many other ways, all the different traits that we spoke of. They're very hardworking, they're very fluent, they're very thoughtful, they're well researched, they have good command over different languages, the media. But I think that's one key differentiation point I want to make.
Yeah, thank you, Harsh.
I actually agree with Harsh, and I think that's remarkably on the spot, in the very simple way that, think of Jignesh Mevani as a politician who's trying to come up with a social movement. And I think what may be happening as a result of this, and I'm going to put my foot in my mouth, I think is that the current generation of the politicians is always one step behind the social movement rather than leading them.
Yeah, and I think one of the case studies that has stuck with me, and I was going to talk about it, is also Jignesh Mevani's case study for multiple reasons, and I'll come back to it. My next question, I think, would be expected is about dynasty. 17 out of the 20 people are dynasts that you interviewed, and I think, like Harsh said, there is a reason for it. You talk about, I think, in other parts where regional parties are headed by dynasts. So, one, what are the pros and cons of this dynastic politics we are in? I don't want to go too much about why it exists. It does. What can people who don't come from dynasties, what are their pathways? Because I think that's most of our target audience and people who are watching this. What can they do if most of the people in the limelight are these dynasts leaders and it's going to stay in the family? How do people who have the moral courage and imagination to be principal leaders and principal politicians, how do they enter? What do they do?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure we'll have the best answer for it, because it's really, it strikes at the heart of the dilemma that a lot of young aspirants face, maybe some in the Indian School of Democracy and many others. At some point, I know I have faced this question for myself when, at some point I was like, I want to go into politics. And then everyone around me asked me, well, how are you going to get into that system? And I was like, well, that's a good question. Without family, it's very hard. So I think if you look at the journeys of the few people we've interviewed who've been able to get into the system and make a name for themselves within it, have impact without having family here. I'm looking at, say, Smriti Irani, for instance, Rajavardhan Rathore. Both of them had very promising careers that took them to some fame before they entered politics. And I think having that level of fame, popularity among people, of course, will help. That's a big asset when you can go to a political party and say, okay, I'm already recognized by so many people. You see that in the South as well, of course, with so many actors and actresses, eventually transitioning into politics much later. With Jignesh Mevani, it's an interesting one, right? He's led many street movements. He started with the Una agitation. That's, to me, a very interesting pathway. Not always successful, but you have to admire him for what he's done. He's led so many of these movements, and it's essentially been a much more of a bottom-up entry rather than a lateral entry. But I think beyond that, it's hard to prescribe a specific move. But every politician we spoke to is hopeful of changing that, is hopeful of trying to find more and more ways of integrating younger leaders. But at the same time, the more I analyze it from an outside perspective, the more I see that even those younger leaders sometimes have to give way to someone else who's had some dynastic connection. Professor, I'll give it to you.
I don't have much to add to that. Nemanji, that's a very, very difficult question. And the reason it becomes difficult is, Harsh has heard this N number of times, and I'll just repeat this. He's probably bored of it by now. That dynastic politics in India is unusual in the very simple way that India has parties that are run by families. If I was to say to you, and your viewers may be surprised to hear this, is that there are more dynastic politicians in Japan and Philippines than there are in India, at least in the legislature. So, it's certainly not the case that the only way to enter politics is to become a dynast. Right, is to be part of a dynasty, because if you just look at the raw numbers, you can be in politics. So we need to distinguish between entering politics and becoming a major leader of a party, and not what we mean by major leader is not a major leader, but heading a party. And I think those are slightly different things. And to me, the sad part of Indian politics, and this I think is sad, is my personal view, it's moral judgment, is that extremely capable leaders may find that they can move up, but only to a certain point. And moving up to that certain point may also not be bad. I mean, it is not a bad outcome to have politically. But I think it is not fair to say that you have to be a dynast to actually enter politics, because the data doesn't support that. It gives you some advantages for sure, but given the vast number of legislators that exist in India, given the vast number of local sarpanches that exist in India, MLAs that exist in India, I think the number of dynasts is not that large. So I think, we should just not focus on the top people, because parties are run by dynasties, and why parties are run by dynasties is a separate order problem we can talk about. Maybe.
Yeah. That brings me to Jignesh Mewani's interview. I think you asked him, you're connected to other people, whether it's Hardik or Sheila or Kanhaiya. Why independent then? And I know he gives the answer, but for those who've not read the book, it would be great, because a lot of times I know when I thought I'll contest, I said I don't align with any party. Maybe I'll just contest and as an independent. It's very romantic to think that that's possible. So what are the pros and cons of that? And what is Jignesh Mewani's thinking around why is he independent? And I know he talks about what are the downsides of it. So would love for one of you or both of you to share some insights on that.
Sure. So he, as you must have read Hibakshi, he speaks in very direct, provocative, and colorful language, which made it a really fun interview to be part of. And he says it very openly. He literally calls this system an ocean of filth. He talks about doing deals with the devil, which he wants to avoid, and that's why he's decided he's not aligned himself to any of the parties that he could have. Having said that, I mean, having taken outside support from the Congress, in a way he has, but I think that to him, the way he sees it is that that's the only extent to which he's willing to go. Anything beyond that means he will have to compromise on what he sees as the most significant values that he holds. He'll have to be striking deals with parties. He'll have to compromise on his own principles. And he says he's not willing to do that. There's a separate question you asked, which is that he's in touch with all these other leaders and has not been able to join one of the parties or bring together what he calls a rock solid youth platform, which our interpretation would be some version of another party of that these individuals come and form together. I think he would have loved to see that, but it's harder to do in practice. So the easier thing for a Hardik Patel to do is go and join the Congress in Gujarat and try and revive it, where you have an existing party organization. The harder thing to do is join another Jignesh Mewani, get Kanhaiya Kumar, and then 3 leaders in their mid-20s or late 20s, try and build a party from scratch. So I think that's the essential struggle. One thing to note is that, he's not blinded by the romantic idea of being an independent. He's very well aware of the glass ceiling that, if you will, that comes with in politics. So he knows that without that, he probably won't be able to rise, without a party, I should say, he probably won't be able to rise to the level that he can, or make the kind of impact he can. I think he's just stuck between a rock and a hard place in his own mind as to what he should do. Professor Chhibber, if you have any.
No, I don't have anything to that. But, so while we were doing this book, we actually, for complicated sets of reasons, we met Pappu Yadav, who is well known in Bihar and, is a poster child for many people for all kinds of reasons. And so if I have a moment, let me share the interesting story with you. So Pappu Yadav says, come to my house. So we go to his house And in the back of his house, we did not know this, he takes us, and there are 7 or 8 rooms, maybe more. Each of those rooms is filled with people. And all those people are people who have come to Delhi from wherever, who want medical treatment. And he has a whole staff who feeds them and actually makes sure that these people get the requisite medical treatment in Delhi. So he's doing that out of his house, his MP's house in Delhi. And, nobody's making any noise about this, nobody's saying anything about this. So while we are there, he gets a telephone call from some bureaucrat. And, saying essentially, he calls a bureaucrat and asks the bureaucrat to do something. And I asked him, I said, why should a bureaucrat listen to you? And he said, the bureaucrat has to listen to me because if the bureaucrat does not listen to me, I will have 500 or 1,000 people outside the office tomorrow. Okay? So what you've got to ask yourself is, what is the level of politics that you want to operate in? If you want to operate in politics at the local level, it is indeed possible to be an independent politician as long as you can mobilize and galvanize people, you will have a voice. If you want to go further up and actually make your own political party, you have to cross the hurdle, which Amakshi, you pointed out, and Harsh said it so eloquently, is you have to cross this hurdle of trying to bring people together under a common platform. And there the hurdle is harder because most Indian voters do not vote for candidates unless the candidate is a standout. They will vote for a party. And if people are voting for parties because they know parties are the ones that come to power and can deliver resources, it becomes very hard for an independent candidate to win. So I think, just keep that in the back of your head. You can be a politician at various levels. Not everybody has to be the Prime Minister of India. Only one person can be.
Yes, I think that's our theory of change as well. We need a critical mass of good politicians so that the system shifts and the needle on politics shifts, and not all of them need to be cabinet ministers or prime ministers. Yeah. Our hope is that more of them choose to be grassroots politicians where they're in touch with citizens and they're listening to the demands of citizens much more. 2 more questions from my end before we kind of move to the audience. The first is actually when I was reading KTR's interview and Mr. OSC's interview, they want to be progressive. They're actually very progressive in their real life, whether it's their thoughts on caste and religion and just how they are as regular citizens. But they had to behave differently. You talk about unlearning, I think, with KTR. And they have to behave differently. And my worry is this, that ideally leaders should be elevating the level of society, right? That's what leaders with moral courage and imagination do. But the current system, and I'm saying all political parties, our current political system is making the mean kind of come lower instead of elevating where the equilibrium kind of settles on. So any thoughts on this? And maybe for benefits of readers, you can talk about some tidbits from these conversations and how you think about it. Like, what will it really take? That's a sub-question, I realize, to elevate the level of the political discourse rather than settling at a slightly and a constantly lowering equilibrium in some ways?
Before we answer that question, may I ask you a question? Sorry for being nerd about this. What do you mean by raising the discourse and lowering the discourse? If you specify that, perhaps we'll have a better sense.
I go back to when the Constituent Assembly was talking, right? Like it took someone raising their voice and saying that everyone should have a vote in a society in a time where it wasn't common for everyone to have a vote. So someone raised their voice and that elevated the political discourse about it. And how should we be structured? Who should have representation? Who should not have representation? Should we have reservation, not reservation? I do think these are conversations which talk about elevating the discourse of a society. And I know it's relative, so I think that point taken. But in general, moving towards a more inclusive and moving towards a democracy or a system where more voices are heard, if not all voices are heard. So I think broadly, that's what I mean.
Prakash, you wanna go first?
No, you're the expert on this.
Well,
give me some time to think. You are used to thinking on your feet. You're a business. I'm not.
So, well, Himakshi, I don't have a great answer for you, but here's so to give some context to the students and viewers. K.T. Ramarao, when we spoke to him about his evolution in politics, he talked about how he was educated in urban schools. He transferred out, moved around a lot, but always was at an urban institution. And when he came back and he joined politics and he heard people talk about caste, wanted to give tickets on caste, he said initially it made him very uncomfortable. He was shocked to see it. He was shocked to see it within his own party. And he then talks about having to unlearn a lot of what he learned and relearn it and reorient himself to understand the realities on the ground, which is that caste matters. It matters to a lot of people. It is core to their identity. And for a whole host of historic reasons, which we've all studied, there's a good reason and good argument to be made that you should be potentially in some cases allocating tickets or doing things for specific caste groups who've been historically disadvantaged. Or that's one part of it. The second part of it is just that this is the real politics. This is the reality on the ground, and that you want to win elections, you have to do it. I think he's become comfortable with the idea. I think what your question, with your question, what you're saying is that how do we will we ever have the reverse, right? Will we ever have that a guy who's actually come from that caste mindset enters politics and says, okay, I don't need it anymore? And to that, I think, again, Professor Chhibber can probably give a better answer, but I think my view on this is that ultimately these things mirror society. Our politicians will mirror Politics will mirror society. Our politicians will mirror the people. And until and unless we are able to make those changes on a large scale and on the ground, change people's mindsets, change their behaviors, until that happens, along with a whole host of other things like, you have urbanization, the economy, different pieces that actually Jignesh Mevani may not even agree with what I'm saying here, because he argues that the economy and urbanization hasn't actually had as much impact on eradicating the influence of caste on our lives. But my personal view is that it has some effect. So until and unless you have all that, and there's we won't see that change. This is just my long-winded view on this.
Thank you, Harsh. I think as always, I just have two responses to that question. And my first response is that democracy, especially electoral democracy, straddles, two aims, Himakshi. On the one hand, democracy is a radical idea because it gives everybody a voice. But on the other hand, winning elections, democracy is also a very conservative idea. It's a conservative idea because people want to ensure that the system they have stays in place. That's why they continue to vote their interest, right? So Himakshi's interest is to have the Indian School of Democracy work. And if there's a political program that comes about, they say, listen, we need to destroy the Indian School of Democracy. Himakshi will say, wait a minute, I think this is the right thing to do. So you will defend your existing interests. So democracy straddles this line between promising a radical idea, but actually at the same time being an extremely conservative idea in some senses, and that's the tension you're getting at. The other thing which I think Harsh and I have written about this quite a bit, and actually I've said this, but nobody cares. I think the one major weakness in Indian politics is that Indian politicians don't know what makes them win or what makes them lose. And because if they don't know what makes them win and what makes them lose, they are going to turn reliably to the tropes that people are familiar with and the people keep repeating. And the history of Indian politics is littered with the destroyed ambitions of one-term politicians. Because they actually have no idea what's going on. They have less idea what's going on than they would like to think they do.
Yeah.
And I think until we can have a more informed political class, which actually can deal with what's happening on the ground in a more substantive way, it's going to be extremely difficult to actually, get to where you want to get to. Right? So, which is, you walk away from these existing tropes and maybe you find new challenges. But remember always, democracy is both radical and conservative.
That is such a great insight, because we talk a lot about how do we codify what makes people win. Because if we are able to do that, of course, we'll be able to help our students better. And we've read multiple books, I think, written by our peers. But I don't think there's anything conclusive, and hence leaders falling back on that. I think that's a great insight. I disagree with Harsh a little bit in the sense that social change leads to political change, or political change leads to social change. I think I'll align more with Ambedkar to say that political tools can be used to bring about social change. Some leaders will need to make the choices, I think, to use those political tools they have to bring about the social change. But I know that's a much longer conversation without any particular answer. I'll ask my question, and I know you've spoken about this, which is about women in politics. So as you know, Indian School of Democracy runs a special program for women in politics called She Represents. And in our other programs also, 50% participants are women, because we want to see more women, unlike what we have in the current parliament or state assemblies, or effectively even at a local level. You interviewed 5 women out of the 20, and all 5 of them very strong. I think each interview left me, and I could be biased, leaving stronger, because they're vulnerable, they're funny, they're strong, they're confident. What, according to you, did you notice that was different about these 5 women that you interviewed as compared to the 15 men that you interviewed?
That's a great question. So, one thing that I'll tell you, Himakshi, about the women we interviewed, totally agree with your assessment. Very personable, very confident, very hardworking in a way where they are able to better balance their personal lives, professional lives. So I think there's a lot to admire in them. And as Poonam Mahajan, says to us in her interview, women don't have wives to take care of their kids when the kids fall sick. And so it's really admirable that they are able to manage and straddle everything that they have to. The second thing is, I found that, I can go one by one, each individual, but together, many of them are actually aligned, despite them being across these different parties, very aligned on what needs to be done for women empowerment and the advancement of women in politics. And what was striking was that, they've given it much more thought than what you'd imagine. It's not the typical, reserve seats for us, or just constantly advance our interests. As Sushmita Dev tells us, it is impossible for this change to happen on a large scale without the men being first educated about it. So she's like, everyone's talking about tokenism. Everyone wants to say, okay, I'll put women in here, I'll put a woman in this position, I'll do all of this. But she's like, none of that is going to permeate and stick until we have, education for men. We want men to be the ones in power who are then driving these changes, which some would argue, the prime minister has tried to do, different prime ministers have tried to do as well. But I think that was interesting. Overall, fantastic additions to fantastic conversations, fantastic leaders.
Thanks, Harsh.
Yeah, Himakshi, my view is aligned with Harsh's. I think you're asking a very, very difficult question. And I'll be honest with you, because the research on this is quite a lot, and the amount we don't know is also a lot. So first, I think, to me, the real issue is what Smriti Irani says. She says in her interview to us, and I think this is a really powerful line, that the problem is not being a woman in politics, the problem is being a woman in power. And so we need to separate women getting into politics and voting and so on and so forth, women being more politically engaged. at the local level, so women could be politically engaged in, economic issues or social issues. That's one issue, one thing. The other is what you're asking is, I'm going to put women in charge. And that's a longer and a tougher battle to fight in a deeply conservative and patriarchal society like India. And so you have to be extremely tough, I think. And you actually have to be a little bit tougher than the men, because you cannot take any nonsense. You've got to protect your interests. You've got to protect your emotional interests, your physical interests, and you've got to deal with the fact that there will be men, as Smriti Irani points out, and she even names these people, who will want to speak for you or on your behalf. And that is a long-term battle to fight. As Supriya Sule said, social change takes a long time. And so I think, to me, that's the real challenge, accepting women as leaders. Society, men politicians have to accept that.
Yes. And I think that's why I love the line that she says about what would she want on her grave, which is like, okay, now she's someone else's headache, because she's so used to being tough. And I love that confidence. And I'm going to move to audience questions. Prakhar, thank you for curating them for us. The first question is from Pallavi. And her question is, why 20? And what were the filters that you chose to select these 20? So if maybe one of you could answer that, that'd be nice.
Sure. So, Pallavi, the answer is that we didn't actually, it wasn't as scientific as you'd imagine. We started out with a long list of 30 to 40 politicians who we thought, would make the cut, who would be interesting. And then there was a series of different factors that finally influenced who ended up making the final 20 in the book. The way we went about it was an iterative process. So we said, okay, we're going to start with these 3 or 4 who we know we would want in the book for sure, and who, we trust to be good, and who we then asked, who do you think? This is the list. So we would go around with this physical list to every interview we had. At the end of the interview, we were like, hey, this is our list of others. You've interacted with all of them. What do you think? So this was, and we got great insights from that, by the way. I was shocked that so many BJP leaders told us, you should definitely add Owaisi to this list. And we were like, he's almost 50. He's not looked at as a next generation leader. He's been like, no, you must add him to the list because he's so brilliant. This coming from the BJP, who they're permanent enemies, but the acknowledgement and appreciation of his actual brilliance was far higher on the BJP side than even on the Congress or any other party. So we went to journalists, we went to politicians, we kept refining the list. And then we'd ask some of them to help us get to some of their colleagues, or we would reach out. And I think one lens through that one filter we always looked at was, okay, we want to have diversity in terms of region, for one. So we made sure we have someone from the Northeast. We wanted someone from the East. We wanted a couple of people from the South. We may have not got all of it, but having, gotten Omar Abdullah from Kashmir, having gotten Owaisi and KTR from the South, having gotten Kalikesh from the East, we want to make sure we're able to represent as many regions as we could. We want to make sure we get as many parties as we could, and we were fortunate to have the leaders of many of these parties there as well. So from Akhilesh Yadav to KTR, in some way Aditya Thakeray, it maybe not officially, but at least a strong influencing factor. 3, we want to, of course, have as many women as we could potentially. And then we had a whole host of other factors. We want to make sure we get people with administrative experience in government and people with party experience, people from street movements like a Jignesh Mevani, people outside of them. Dynasts, the reality is we had to have dynasts, make sure we had some non-dynasts as well. And then finally, it comes down to who we could possibly get to sit down with us for 1.5 hours in the middle of a busy election year, and after that, to sit and share candid thoughts. And so most of them, to their credit, all of the ones we interviewed never asked for a single question beforehand, which I thought was very impressive. So it was totally unscripted, which was our mandate. But in a case or two where we felt that we won't be able to have that, we could not do the interview. So that was the last piece, that we needed to make sure that we not only get access to an completely no holds barred interview, but we're able to meet those individuals in person, because we felt that that would be very integral to our experience and our ability to make assessments.
Yeah, and I think this is a plug for the book, which I'll make towards the end as well. I think they don't, both Pradeep and Harsh don't offer their insights, which I love. They don't offer their analysis. They've kept the conversations as real and verbatim as possible, but they do describe their experience of approaching, I think almost before every interview, that they sat in the office, whether Jignesh Bhivani was sitting on his uncomfortable bed, and they had to wait for a few hours outside a certain office, which also makes you imagine the kind of lives they live in a very vivid way. So I love that writing style and the choice there. I'm going to move to Harsha's question, which is, and I think his question is to Pradeep, and he's saying, do we need a legislative reforms, a model political parties act to facilitate robust internal democracy and bring down entry barriers for young people?
You will have to get the political parties to agree to it. Right. So in other words, I agree with Harsha's question. I think ideally what you're asking for is parties should have democracy within themselves. So in other words, there should be party democracy. So for instance, if you're going to have candidates who is going to be a candidate, let's say from Bangalore South, that should be chosen by the people. That's a primary model, which the Congress tried but failed. It did not work. So as far as inner party democracy is concerned, you could pass legislation, but I think it is going to be a tough legislation to pass because the parties have to agree to it, and most of the parties are run by Danis. So the likelihood of them agreeing to pass a legislation that would undercut their own power is small. I'm sorry, to be realistic about this. So I think that's the one thing that stands in the way of actually serious reform within the political parties. I think the other thing that stands in the way is that we need to have a very serious conversation, and you guys should be better at this than I, on campaign finance. Because a lot of party control is rooted in money. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about what it takes to run a campaign. And in fact, even well-meaning, well-known politicians, and I will not take their names right now, if we have a conversation, they would be willing to, I'm sure, put their name on it, which is, it costs too much money to run a campaign, just realistically, even if you have to reach voters. So let me throw a question out to all of you to think about. If you believe politics is about representative democracy, and that ideally a politician should be reaching out to every voter, how much money do you think it would cost for a politician to reach every voter in an MP constituency? And how long do you think it would take? And what is the best way to do it? If you believe that's important, we have to restructure our campaigns. And without belaboring the point, we have this belief somehow. There's this morality belief, I would pardon my language now, this kind of belief that things should be morally correct. And I don't know where that's coming from in some ways. What it says is that only rich people enter politics. We need to curb their power. Therefore, we're not going to give them any time or money to run an election. And to me, that strikes at the very heart of the idea of a representative democracy. So if at some point we can have a serious conversation about money, a realistic conversation, not moral preaching, I think that would go a long way in actually changing the party system, and that may be an easier conversation to have than changing introducing changes in parties through the legislature, because the vested interests in parties.
Yeah, 100% aligned. And we've spoken, I think, when we did the conversation with Rajiv Gowda sir, he's spoken a lot about electoral finance. And in general, a lot of people have written about electoral finance. So I'd encourage everyone to just try and read and see what's being said and what are the problems in it getting passed as well, because I think it's at the heart of entry barriers for a lot of people in politics. I'm going to take Sashwat Kumar's question. It's slightly long, but I think it's an interesting one. So he says that leaders like Lalu, Mulayam, Ramvilas, etc. started under one umbrella party, moved up the ladder together, and then fragmented and founded their own parties. The children are now running these parties. Do you think these new leaders can come together on ideologies and economies like their parents did, or would cause further fragmentation? Bihar elections 2020 is a good reference when Nitish is up against Tejasvi and Chirag. Anyone of you or both?
Professor, you want to take that?
Yeah, sure. So, Shashwat, this is a long and complicated question. And the reason is, unfortunately, the reason it's complicated is the following. Many of these leaders, the Lalu Yadav, Mulayam Singh Yadav, Paswan, many of them actually came together as leaders in the socialist movement, where they were representing the other backward classes. That was the basic idea. Now, if you're representing the other backward classes, there's a common ideology that can unite you. And the socialist ideology that united many of these leaders is what brought them forth. Now what happens is, and this is what happens on the ground, is that Lalu Yadav comes to power in Bihar, Mulayam Singh Yadav comes to power in UP, Paswan cannot come to power because he doesn't have enough clout within a state, but can be an important national player, and he's been in union cabinet with lots of people. Now, if you think about what happened, the moment Lalu Yadav comes to power and Mulayam Singh Yadav comes to power, and this is the tragedy of Indian politics, the backward class movement becomes replaced by a backward caste/backward jati movement. So the Mulayam Singh Yadav party morphs into a Yadav party. Lalu Yadav's party loses its moorings and loses the Kurmi support, for example, loosely speaking, in Bihar, leaving space for somebody like the JDU to come about and say, we represent the actual social consciousness of the poor, because the social consciousness of the poor that was initially represented by somebody like Lalu Yadav is now in the hands of this family. So the moment you come into politics and your party becomes centered around you and your family, right? The nature of what's the coalition you put together fragments. And the coalition you put together fragments for a very simple reason, that the Yadavs want access, in the case of UP, to state power, but the Kurmis are left out. And the Kurmis can quite frankly find a better deal with the BJP, because they can say, listen, if we align with the BJP, at least we are in power in the state. And for those of you who want to read this, I would urge you to read a book by Jeffrey Witso called Democracy Against Development, and his articles on Bihar. And I think he has a seminar, or he's having a concurrent seminar. I think he had one yesterday in the Bihar elections. He has written the most insightful work on why Bihar politics looks the way it does. And I would urge all of you to read it. But that's essentially what's happening, that you form a class movement, you come to power, you convert the class movement into a political party. The political party becomes a family concern. The moment it becomes a family concern, ethnic outbidding can happen. So the Kurmis can say, listen, I have a better deal with the BJP, right? And they do. That's all that's, that's what's going on. And the same thing is happening in, in UP. And then I'll throw out a finally provocative question for all of you to think about. What is the reason that all the different backward classes, Muslims, Dalits, OBCs, should unite? The only way you can think of them uniting is if you can think of them fighting against the upper castes. But if you just think of the fight against the upper caste, then this leaves about 80% of the population. And there will be conflict within them as to who is going to take power, right? We assume that there is one social consciousness uniting them. But if they have different economic interests, if they have different political interests, if they have different social interests, there is no reason to expect this coalition to be formed. And everywhere in India, you see this coalition breaks apart. And the reason it breaks apart is that interests are different. The social prejudices are different. And we've got to acknowledge that and accept it, right? Otherwise, we will never get to bringing together a meaningful social politics that actually addresses the deep inequalities that exist.
Yeah. I think KTR mentions that a little bit about why he is glad he educated himself about these social cleavages, because it's one thing to be anti-caste and one thing to completely be caste blind. I think being caste blind is trendy or woke, but it doesn't serve the purpose because it doesn't make you listen to the voices of so many people who've been traditionally disadvantaged. So that's something that I think we talk a lot about in our programs. I'm going to take one last question from Sulabh, and I want to ask one question myself. So we go 5 minutes over. So Sulabh's question is, what's your view on multi-party to bi-party? Which one do you see in future? So I think what he means is like a two-party system versus a multi-party system. Which one is India heading towards?
Yeah. Harsh, you got your crystal ball ready?
No. I mean, Professor Chhibber studies party politics and is one of the foremost people who does it in the world. So I would not want to get in the way of him answering that.
Oh, thank you so much. Just somebody said this to us many days ago, to which I do not have an answer. Academic Shruti Kapila, who teaches at Cambridge, I was giving this talk and stopped and asked me a question and just stopped me dead in my tracks, so I don't have an answer. Indian politics veers between a one-party dominant system and coalitional multi-party politics. The idea of a two-party system is not going to happen. So India will not have a two-party system anytime coming up. I don't see that. There may be two poles, ideological poles. One may be slightly left of center, one may be slightly right of center. But that's very loosely defined. The trajectory so far is, remember, there was a period of Congress dominance. Now we have BJP dominance, and the middle there was a holy mess, right? And my guess is once the BJP fragments and loses, which it will, because that's the nature of democratic politics, it has to happen. The question is when, right? I'm just being realistic, right? The Congress fell apart. The BJP is eventually, you will run out of steam. And the question is, under what conditions will you run out of steam, right? And if you think maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years, then what will we get next? We will not get two-party politics. We'll get coalition politics for a while, right? That's my guess, given the past, right? So I'm going to stop there.
Yes. Thank you, both of you. And I'm really sorry for those questions that I could not take. Actually, I made an assumption that a lot of them got answered in their earlier remarks. So I do apologize. I want to ask one last question. So I think all these 20, except Jignesh Bhivani, come from a certain or are at a certain advantage space. And you acknowledge that, I think, in the introduction or somewhere. Or maybe I've seen too many interviews. But we at Indian School of Democracy are trying to do a compilation of 50 case studies of around 5 or 6 known politicians, but the rest 44 or 45 are unknown people, like a Sarpanch in Bihar or Kerala or Odisha, or actually all parts of the place, Sarpanches, corporators and MLAs who we don't talk about, who have not become very famous, because we think there's a lot to learn from them. And there's also the hypothesis is that it will make politics more relatable and it will make politics less scary. So my question is, as someone, as two people who've done this study, deep conversations with 20 people, what would your advice be as we try to get to know journeys of these political leaders who are probably less famous? But yeah, what should we be looking for? What should we be asking them?
And Himakshi, is the goal to, in a similar fashion, unravel their individual personalities and also document their journeys and try and pattern match among all the 50?
We're not trying to pattern match it much. It's just putting different journeys out there and say, this is how someone went about their elections, the work that they've done, and this is the journey they were coming from before they entered politics. And these are the reasons why they chose politics. And these were the challenges they faced. So mostly curating rather than trying to synthesize them, because I think it would be I don't know if we'd get there, but that's one question I have, just to bring more stories out there. Like if I want to be a doctor, I know I have hundreds of stories and pathways to pick from in terms of how does one become a doctor. But we want to get this conversation more out there about like how do people and why do people become politicians, people like you and me, and people we meet on the street. So that's the goal.
Got it. Well, I think it's a fantastic goal, and having gone through the journey in some way ourselves, but with more prominent figures whose journeys to some extent are well documented in the public domain, I think it's even better when you can get stories out of individuals whose journeys are not in the public domain, and have those stories inspire a lot of your students and other political aspirants. So I think it's a fantastic goal. I think the one thing I'd say is the key, once again, is in the process by which you eventually land up on your 50. So I think for us, that was key. It wasn't how we had planned it, but that eventually, making sure you're able to iterate on that process, making sure you're able to make changes, being willing to give up on one if it's not particularly striking, but making sure you can, get the ones who you think will really inspire others, and making sure you have enough diversity. I think that's definitely the key. But sounds fantastic. Professor, do you have any other advice to add?
Yeah, I actually think this is a great project. And I'll say this upfront, if you want, I'll be glad to work with you on this, because I think it's utterly fascinating, right? But I think to me, the most important thing is, other than adding on, once you get to the interview, you've got to first have done a little bit of background research, which is not easy. You must know something about the person, something about their policy, something about them, because you just can't walk into it blind. Number two, and this is something Harsh and I tried, and you may not think this is the case, you have to approach the politicians and interviewing them with empathy, not as an adversary. And I think this may sound like, self-flattery, but I think one of the reasons they were willing to continue speaking to us because our conversations were not adversarial. And we would ask an open question, they would answer, and then we would have a set of questions in our head. We would practice those beforehand. So in other words, if we were going to see a person, we say, okay, these are the things we need to ask. We've done a background research. Harsh and I would divide them, but once you sat down, some got asked, some didn't get asked, and you let the conversation flow. But the only way that can happen is you need empathy. And I cannot stress that enough. So in other words, if you have young people going out to interview a sarpanch, they've got to interview the sarpanch with an open mind and a willingness to learn and a willingness to listen. If you have any bit of an attitude saying, I'm going to get you for this thing you've done wrong, it's over, right? So I think that's really important. Now, that has its strength and its weaknesses, and many people asked us, why didn't you ask the got you question, or this corruption scandal, or that corruption scandal? It's pointless, right? Because it's not going to get you anything, right? So for example, when we asked Priyanka Gandhi about Robert Vadra, we asked about, how do you deal with this in the family, right? Because that's the thing we want, that's coming from a position of empathy and sympathy rather than a position of, I'm here to put you down, or I'm here to get you, right? Only then will you learn things. That's my view. And not everybody would agree with that, but that's my perspective. And I think both Harsh and I were deeply conscious. We never spoke about this, but that was we had this common understanding that that's what we were aiming for.
I agree with that.
That's such a beautiful note to end on. And actually, I wasn't planning on doing this, but again, I'm going to flash something on the screen, which is our manifesto, which talks about how would we want a politician to be, and listening and empathy are an important part. I'm going to put it out there for the audience to read. As I say, thank you to both Pradeep and Harsh just for being here and sharing so much. I definitely want to encourage everyone to pick up the book and read. I'm happy to lend my copy to a few people who are in Delhi, because I meet a lot of politicians. I've met a lot of them in the past 2 years as we set up Indian School of Democracy. But it's just almost a gift to have all of these thoughts together, because it's not about a policy or what you hear in the parliament or read in the news. It's about them as people. I think, yeah, I definitely remember the parts about Priyanka Gandhi talking about going to her kids' schools to talk to them about what has happened. And those things stick, and those make you really see the person behind all the glamour. So thank you for writing the book. Thank you for coming here. And thanks to our audience for being here. Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you for a great conversation. Thank you, and thank you to your audience as well.
Thank you. This was great.
This is great.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you both. I've stopped the recording. So.
Okay.